Okay, welcome back to another video. Today, I'm going to be walking you through the camera settings that I know and use to get the best footage possible while you're deer hunting. Alright, so first of all, you may notice the smoker behind me, and Cody might be walking back and forth in the frame. It's such a nice day outside. I decided to make this video outside just because it's so nice. So we'll just throw out there that those black marks on my face and arms are from stain. So I do want to give credit where credit is due. You want to join me, Missy? Yeah. So I did learn a lot about cameras and filming and settings in that course that I took online. So I'll try to link that down below if you want to take it. It says the sale price is around $200. They often run sales where you can get it for $10 or $15. So the first thing that you need to know about camera settings and exposure is what is called the exposure triangle. And that basically consists of 3 different components all inside of your camera, all the customizable settings that make up exposure. So the first one is shutter speed. Basically, as you're watching this video right now, you're watching a whole bunch of pictures playing really fast back to back. So if you have a 24 frames per second video, you're watching 24 different pictures on your screen in 1 second. So 24 frames per second is kind of standard in the video and film industry. So if you shoot a video in 120 frames per second, later when you're editing, you can slow that video down to 25%, and it'll be playing at 25 frames per second. And so you're basically taking the exact same amount of time and stretching it out, which as you play across it, it'll play much slower back. Here's a video shot in 30 frames per second, and here is a video shot in 120 frames per second and slowed down in post-production to 25 frames per second. So in order to understand shutter speed, you really have to understand frame rate first, and that's why I went with frame rate. So now to talk a little bit more about shutter speed, each of those pictures that you're watching have to have a shutter speed, which is how long that sensor is exposed to light. So if you have a slow shutter and your sensor is exposed to light for a long time, you'll have much more light in the image, but if you move the camera, it'll make it a lot blurrier. It's the same basic principle as taking pictures, as far as faster your shutter speed, the quicker it'll freeze the motion. The slower your shutter speed, the brighter the image will be, but the blurrier it'll be. So check out this video here of me waving my hand in front of the camera. This is shot at 1/60th of a second, and if you pause it, you'll notice how the hand is blurry. Now this video was shot in 1/1000th of a second shutter, which is much faster, and if you pause the video, you'll notice that the hand is not blurry and it's captured clear. So the faster your shutter speed is, the darker the image will be, which means that the opposite is true as well, that the slower your shutter speed is, the brighter it is, which means that generally as you get down to last light, you're getting into that last hour, you're going to have to start dropping your shutter speed in order to make your video brighter. That way your video is not black when you see that deer at last light. So as a general rule of thumb, you want your shutter speed in video to be 2 times what your frame rate is. So let's say I'm shooting 24 frames per second. I should have my shutter speed at 1/50th of a second shutter in order to get the right motion blur. The next component on that exposure triangle is aperture, or f-stop. And this is really a fairly simple concept, and that really entirely has to do with the lens that you have. This lens that I'm shooting on right now has a low f-stop, so if you notice how blurry this section back in here is, that's because I'm shooting with a low f-stop, a low aperture. It's the same thing. But if you have a higher aperture, the background will be less blurry. Generally, the less blurry your background is, the less cinematic and less professional your video looks. So aperture is basically the amount of light that your lens lets in. So if you hear people talking about a big aperture or a fast aperture, that basically means it's a low aperture. The lens is big and it's letting in a lot more light. The higher your aperture is, the less light it lets in. So think about it. The less light it lets in, the darker your video will be. So I generally like to shoot at the lowest aperture possible. So a standard kit lens goes anywhere from f3.5 to 5.6-ish in that range. So some of the better lenses will come with lower apertures, generally around f2.8, which most certainly gives you more background blur than a traditional kit lens. But after those higher end lenses, you get down into prime lenses, which are simply lenses that you cannot zoom on. And in order to zoom in, you have to get closer or further away from your subject. So that can work good in a hunting scenario for like an interview or whatever. If the person is talking to the camera at a set distance, you can use a prime lens and get a really good effect with a lot of background blur. But I would not recommend that as your main lens for hunting. Most prime lenses come in either 30 or 35 millimeter, and then 50 millimeter, 85 millimeter, and like 135 millimeter, something like that. The best lenses that I know of go down to f1.2, and those lenses have a crazy bokeh, which bokeh is that bubbly, blurry background stuff that you see. That kid in the van was like, The last component on the exposure triangle is ISO, which internal stabilization optimization, maybe. ISO is basically the amount of fake light, if you will, that the camera puts into an image. So the higher the ISO, the brighter the image will be, but the grainier it will be. Think of how often you've seen a video close to dark and you notice like it's really grainy. You kind of come to expect that with low light filming. So here for a comparison, these are two pictures I took with the lens cap on the camera. The one on the left was taken at ISO 100 and the one on the right was taken at ISO 6400. You might not notice any differences until you zoom in, and you can see that the ISO 100 is much cleaner than the very grainy 6400. So those three components, ISO, shutter speed, and aperture, make up the exposure triangle. You need to figure out how to use each of those to make your image look good. Is that Ty? I think it's Ty.
Hey Ty, you want to leave a comment for me, right?
Ty, if you're watching this video, you just drove by, let me know if you've seen this video. So the key to getting good exposure and a video that looks good is knowing these three settings: aperture, ISO, and shutter speed, and using them in the right combination. So let's say my lens goes to f2.8. I'll generally set the lens to f2.8, and if I'm shooting 30 frames per second, I'll set the shutter speed to 1/60th of a shutter and the ISO as low as I can go. I know some people like to set the aperture at what they want, let's say f2.8 for example, set the ISO at 400 and then have their shutter speed auto, which is just another way of doing that. So the next thing has to do with colors and white balance. So here is this video with too warm of a white balance, and here's this video with too cool of a white balance. So on most DSLR and mirrorless cameras, you can adjust the white balance, which basically determines what is true white under those lighting conditions. It's kind of confusing. I don't fully understand this concept, but how you adjust it makes the warmth and coolness of your video appear different under certain lighting. Those settings can be found inside of your camera. It varies from camera to camera, but if you see white balance, basically what that adjusts is the color temperature of your video. Here comes the dove. Gotta go fetch. Something else that has to do with the color of the video is picture profiles. This was a relatively new concept to me when I got this camera. I'm not fully sure what exactly picture profiles are, but I know on this camera I just am experimenting with S-Log2. It's under picture profile 2 and then S-Log2, and it essentially produces a really flat video. And you might be thinking, so why would you want a video that looks so much flatter and has so much gray in it? But the reason I would do that is because then later in post-production I can really bring out those colors, and I can tame down the highlights and make the overall video more exposed and just give it much better colors. So I'm experimenting with that. I was thinking specifically for weddings. I don't know if I would use it much for hunting, possibly for hunting, but in weddings I think it's especially important to color grade your films correctly. And that's something that I'm going to work on in the next couple wedding films that I shoot. So if you're watching this video and you want to get into hunting and you want to have that cinematic footage and not some camcorder footage, and you might be thinking, like, how do I go about determining what lens to get? I would say generally anything in that 18 to 105 to 24 to 240-ish range will get the job done pretty good if you're only looking for one lens to go film your hunts with. So I hope you found this video helpful and enjoyed it. If you did, we'd appreciate if you would subscribe right down below, right there, if you're watching that on a computer, just right there. Let us know in the comment section what other videos you want to see. I have one more video yet in this series, which I'm going to film right now, and that is shotgun mics versus lav mics. So if you want to see and hear the differences between those two, stick around for the next video. That should be dropping next week. Thanks so much for watching, and let me get on to the next video. It's actually more like I'm going to go out here and eat these back straps now. That's what I'm actually going to do.